I can remember in the very early 80s, I did a live TV interview at UCLA Department of Child Development. And at that time, what they were saying there was horrifying to most of the population. Because essentially what they were saying was that a preschool child, home with their mother was inappropriate. And the interview was taking place in their child development center, and it was a big room with a bunch of little kids running around and a few college students. And what they were saying was, this environment is what's appropriate for a preschool child, because this is a stimulating environment. Right? And fortunately, back at that time, a lot of people were rather horrified at that. Unfortunately, today, most people would sit and nod their head and say, oh yeah, that's right. Because we've bought into that perception that mothers that are not up to the task and kids need to be in a daycare, preschool environment to be stimulated. Well, let me explain what is stimulating, all right? We stimulate the brain by identifying specific appropriate input and then supplying that individual with that specific appropriate input with sufficient frequency, intensity, and duration. Okay. Now you could have 10 children who are 2 years old, and what is specific and appropriate for one is not going to be specific and appropriate for another. And if we have 10 2-year-old children, 9 of them are a distraction to the one. Okay? The further we get, and I don't care if you're talking about an infant, or somebody who's 50, the further you get from one-to-one input, the less specific it becomes. Okay? If you're working, let's say you're home and you're home with a 4-year-old and you're showing your 4-year-old a book about dinosaurs. If what you're doing is specific and appropriate for your 4-year-old, your 4-year-old is engaged, your 4-year-old is enthusiastic, your 4-year-old is responding. And what happens is, as a parent, you automatically modify what you're doing, even without thinking about it, based on what your 4-year-old does. Okay, because you see the 4-year-old starts getting a little antsy. You maybe increase your volume a little bit more. You maybe do less talking and more looking at, pointing at pictures. But you just automatically modify what you're doing to be specific for that child. Okay? If you're reading to 2 kids, you're less specific. And if you're reading to 10 kids, you're totally not specific. And if you got 20 or 30 kids, bet on it, there's nothing specific. Okay? And we call that random input. And random input not only does not stimulate the brain, random input disorganizes the brain. So in many respects, the worst possible environment you can put a young child in is a room full of another group of young children. Right. Yes, ma'am.
So do you perceive any benefits whatsoever to a preschooler attending 2 hours of preschool 3 days a week, say 6 hours of preschool a week? Do you consider that an inhibitor to their development, or does that have any benefit?
The biggest benefit is a break for mom. Okay, and that's valid. Okay, the older the child, the more possible benefit there is. The younger the child, the less. Okay, if you're talking about 4-year-olds, yeah, a couple hours, few times a week, that's probably a good thing. Okay, but if you're talking about, 4 hours, 5 hours, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, that for sure is not a good thing. Okay. It may be a necessary thing. I mean, there are realities, and it may be necessary, but if it is necessary, the parent needs to be aware that they've got to compensate for that by providing their kids with as much one-on-one as they can when they can.
I was going to just ask kind of what you were just alluding to. What are those compensating things? What can be done to compensate for those times that the child is not with them?
Well, the job of the parent is largely to become as knowledgeable as they can about this whole process of child development. With that knowledge and with what support they can get, you can do an awful lot with a little bit of time. I mean, we have one of the things that's been really fun about the work we've done. Most of our kids are kids with issues that we work with directly, and universally, the younger siblings of those children are virtually all accelerated. Okay? Because what the parent learns from working with their child with a problem educates them to the degree that every other child benefits. Okay? And the families that we see that have, if you will, typical kids, what it takes to accelerate and make those kids, put those kids at the top of the heap is so minimal, it's almost shocking. Yeah. I mean, it's really easy.